The air in the seventh-floor conference room was sterile and cold, tasting faintly of burnt coffee and simmering fear. The precise time, 9:02 a.m. Jack's hands, thick and scarred by 35 years of labor, rested motionless on the slick mahogany table. They were the hands of a craftsman, a builder. Across the table sat Evelyn, the head of HR. Her expression a careful, practiced mask of corporate regret. The thin folder of stapled papers between them held the fate of a career. Evelyn cleared her throat, a dry, rasping sound. "Jack, I know this is a shock." She didn't look him in the eye. Mark's final report was extensive. "Based on the documentation, we have no choice but to terminate." Jack did not flinch. He didn't argue, his clear, unsettlingly calm eyes fixed not on Evelyn, but on the single polished silver pen Mark always used, a cheap symbol of false authority. A tiny knowing smile touched Jack's lips. It was cold, dangerous. "I understand, Evelyn," he said, his voice low, steady, and resonant. Mark spent 3 solid months trying to build this case. He did a thorough job. Jack leaned forward, the mahogany groaning softly beneath his weight. "What he didn't know was that I closed the deal to acquire this entire division 3 weeks ago." Evelyn's composure shattered. Her eyes widened into discs of genuine visceral shock. "He tried to fire me," Jack stated, the smile widening into a predator's grin. "An hour later, I became his boss." "This isn't just a promotion, Evelyn. This is how a man who built his career on competence ends a bully's reckless reign." The clock on the wall emitted a loud metallic tick. The smell of adrenaline was thick now. The game had begun. Jack was a relic, not in years, but in principle. He carried the solid, unhurried presence of a man who understood foundation. First he built houses, then he built teams. Finally, he built successful careers. 35 years, a lifetime measured in blueprints, deadlines, and the quiet, undeniable success of seeing a complex project stand tall against the odds. His hands were his true biography. They were thick, permanently marked by chemical burns and years of gripping tools. They showed the scars of commitment. These were the hands of a man who understood structure, integrity, and the simple, brutal truth that shortcuts always fail. He found his sanctuary in the simple, predictable rhythms of the engineering world. The gentle, almost musical hum of the distant servers. The quiet, satisfying click of his old mechanical keyboard, a sound Mark loathed. The scent of freshly printed large-format schematics, paper, and ozone. It was a world of logic where hard work translated directly into a measurable physical result. That peace, earned through decades of sweat and sacrifice, was his greatest reward. In the last decade, Jack had been the invisible tide. He'd saved 3 major disastrous corporate projects from catastrophic collapse, quietly fixing the chaotic, expensive messes left by younger, flashier managers. His competence was a steady, immovable force that kept the entire division afloat. He was the anchor. But anchors are often forgotten, often ignored until the true storm hits. Jack wasn't seeking the spotlight. He didn't crave the shallow accolades of a PowerPoint presentation. He sought only the simple dignity earned by the sweat on his brow, the profound satisfaction of doing a job well. He embodied the rugged ideal of the American work ethic: honest labor, quiet strength, and unwavering reliability. This silent strength, this deep-seated competence, was precisely the thing that made him an irresistible target. It was a truth Mark couldn't tolerate. Jack's existence proved Mark was superfluous. Mark saw him as a slow, inconvenient monument to the past, a monument Mark desperately needed to tear down to prove his own fleeting worth. Mark demanded obedience. Jack offered only results. This was their fundamental terminal clash. Jack's eyes, aged but clear, watched the corporate theater with a mixture of patience and disdain. He knew the rules of construction. He was about to find out how quickly corporate structures could collapse. The division Jack worked for was a sprawl of glass and polished steel, a perfect corporate ecosystem. It was an open-plan office, sprawling and bright, ostensibly designed to promote collaboration, yet it truly amplified paranoia. Every phone call, every hushed conversation, every sigh of frustration was broadcast. The atmosphere was thick with performative energy, loud, meaningless meetings, brightly colored, agile flowcharts, and the relentless, exhausting pursuit of looking busy. The air conditioning was always too cold, the coffee always tasted of chemicals, and the fluorescent lights hummed a perpetual, irritating monotone. The culture had curdled. It had once been a place of camaraderie built on the simple grit of engineering, a place where you could borrow a wrench without a second thought. The work was the only measure, but the new generation, the optimization specialists, demanded spectacle. Competence was now secondary to compliance with an ever-changing, arbitrary set of corporate rules and buzzwords. The old guard, the builders, were slowly being choked out by this bureaucratic vine. The office was Jack's dock. He had built his reputation there, piece by piece, over decades. Now a new foreign vessel, flashy and oversized, was trying to block his path to the shore. It wasn't the work that threatened him. It was the system that valued the packaging over the product. The air felt heavy, saturated with unspoken tension, waiting for the inevitable crack. Then came Mark. In his late 20s, Mark was the embodiment of shallow power. He was handsome, but in a generic, mass-produced way that seemed intentional. He was always aggressively overdressed for the open office, his Italian suits stiff against the muted corporate tones. His leather shoes were aggressively shiny, demanding attention. He carried a silver Mont Blanc pen and perpetually cradled a sleek black iPad under his arm, his personal scepter of technology. Mark was the company's corporate Karen, a man armed with an expensive MBA and, crucially, nepotistic connections that elevated him to a supervisory role long before he had earned the respect of a single subordinate. His lack of technical competence was matched only by his abundance of arrogance. His voice was a bullhorn of corporate jargon amplified across the open office floor. We need to synergize the core competencies. Let's circle back on Q3 deliverables. His opinions were as loud and invasive as his expensive citrus-heavy cologne. Mark didn't build things. He managed perceptions. He policed the tiny details of superficiality, the correct shade of blue for the weekly report, the precise font for email subject lines, the exact hour of arrival and departure. He thrived on the fear of non-compliance terrorizing middle management, with the threat of documentation. His clipboard was invisible, but its authority was felt everywhere. Mark's desk, perpetually sparse and clean, was the antithesis of Jack's organized chaos, a signal that Mark dealt only with the abstract, never with the grease and grit of actual work. He was a predator who saw Jack not as a veteran asset, but as an untouchable monument to the past, a monument Mark desperately needed to tear down to prove his own fleeting worth. He needed to show the system that his way, the way of the flowchart, and the buzzword was superior to Jack's way, the way of the wrench and the hard hat. Mark demanded obedience. Jack offered only results. This was their fundamental terminal clash. Mark believed that rules were weapons to control others. Jack knew the rules were the very foundation of the structure Mark was trying to undermine. The office watched the two men, the young, loud bully and the quiet, immovable veteran, waiting for the first sign of blood. The first shot was not a cannon blast, but a tiny, venomous pinprick. It arrived in Jack's inbox at 10:04 a.m. on a Tuesday. The subject line, all capital letters and digital aggression. Non-compliance Q3 report header formatting. The email was from Mark. It was CC'd to 3 vice presidents and the head of HR. The body was filled with corporate boilerplate accusing Jack of undermining aesthetic uniformity and demanding immediate adherence to Protocol 3.7b to protect the company's brand image. The issue Jack had used a slightly darker shade of blue in the report header, a shade he knew was easier on the eyes for the aging production staff and senior executives. Jack stared at the screen. He felt a dull, familiar ache begin behind his eyes. It wasn't the pain of being caught. It was the sheer exhaustion of wasting time. Jack knew Protocol 3.7b. He had written it 20 years ago. The original text explicitly allowed for legible visual optimization. Mark was using a technicality, a formality to assert dominance. It was the arrogance of youth meeting the quiet strength of experience. Jack deleted the email. He did not reply. He refused to dance to Mark's tune. This refusal, this quiet act of defiance, only fueled the fire in Mark's belly. He saw Jack's silence not as competence, but as cowardice. He decided the veteran needed to be taught a public, painful lesson. Mark retreated to his sleek office, already drafting the next phase of the assault. The tiny, venomous pinprick of the first email was not an isolated incident. It was the first drop of a sustained, irritating drizzle. Mark had found his weapon: corporate paperwork. The barrage began immediately. Monday. Failure to maintain office aesthetics. Mark declared Jack's worn, personalized coffee mug, a gift from his daughter, was non-compliant with departmental branding guidelines. He demanded it be replaced with a generic white ceramic model. It was a petty psychological attack on Jack's personal space, his few anchors in the sterile office. Tuesday. Unapproved resource utilization. Mark cited a minute-by-minute log of Jack's computer activity, claiming Jack had printed too many draft schematics, resulting in unsustainable strain on Q4 paper reserves. The language was inflated, absurd. Wednesday. Lack of proactive alignment. This was the most insidious. A meaningless complaint about the format and timing of Jack's daily task list. Mark used the phrase synergistic misalignment with core competencies 3 times in a single paragraph. Each email was meticulously formatted, filled with bold text and exclamation points, digital aggression masquerading as protocol. Mark was creating a paper trail, building a mountain of minutiae designed to crush Jack beneath its weight. The emails were always CC'd to the maximum number of senior executives. The goal was not correction, but humiliation and documentation. Jack felt a low, constant ache in his jaw. He could feel the eyes of the office on his back whenever a notification dinged. They were watching the veteran being targeted by the sleek new corporate machine. His peace was eroding. He felt the relentless, exhausting drain of having to defend himself against transparent absurdity. Jack spent hours drafting professional, measured replies, debunking each violation with facts and figures. It was time-stolen time he should have spent on his projects, on the real work. Mark thrived on this defense. He needed Jack to lose his temper to show a moment of weakness. But Jack remained calm. He was the anchor. He felt the tension building, the quiet rage coiling deep in his gut. He knew Mark was waiting for him to break. But Jack had survived far worse storms. He was just calculating the structural load of the absurdity. He was waiting for Mark to over-engineer his own collapse. The paper barrage was just the distraction. Mark quickly moved to the real attack: sabotage by subtraction. This was not overt hostility. It was surgical, silent warfare. Mark began deliberately withholding critical data, technical specifications, or necessary sign-offs for Jack's most time-sensitive project, Project Chimera. Jack would attend planning meetings only to find the core data packet, the foundation of his work, was missing or misfiled. Mark would stand at the projector, the beam of light washing out his face, shrugging with a practiced indifference that smelled of calculated malice. "Apologies, Jack." Mark would purr, his voice smooth and devoid of genuine emotion. "I thought you had the latest iteration. Synergistic miscommunication, perhaps." Jack felt the frustration, like a knot tightening in his chest. He was running a marathon with both ankles shackled. Every day became a frustrating hunt for information that should have been on his desk. He spent hours chasing emails, reviewing logs, and scheduling pointless follow-up meetings, all to recover data Mark had intentionally placed in a digital blind spot. The cost was immediate and brutal. Project Chimera, Jack's baby, a crucial Q4 deliverable, slipped its deadline. Mark didn't wait for the dust to settle. He struck with predatory speed. Within an hour of the official delay notice, Mark circulated a massive, brightly formatted email subject line. "Critical project failure, lack of management oversight." He cited the missed deadline and used Jack's inability to deliver a timely report as evidence of terminal systemic breakdown. The language was devastatingly corporate, designed to mask the truth. Mark claimed the delay was due to Jack's inability to leverage necessary resources and lack of proactive resource integration. He never once mentioned the data he himself had stolen. The internal damage was immediate. Jack felt the cold sting of betrayal, not just from Mark, but from the system itself, which blindly accepted Mark's paper over Jack's decades of clean record. Jack stood at his desk, his fists clenched, watching the tiny, infuriating cursor blink on his monitor. He felt the familiar rage boil, but he refused to let it escape. Rage was what Mark wanted, a sign of the aging veteran breaking down. Instead, Jack took a deep, shuddering breath. He felt the heat drain from his face, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. Mark had just forced Jack to choose between his work and his dignity. Jack looked at the email again. The lie was too big, too brazen. Mark had just crossed the line from petty harassment into professional destruction. Jack knew then that this was not a battle for a promotion. It was a battle for his entire career, for his reputation, and for the simple truth. Jack closed his eyes. The time for measured replies was over. The time for investigation was beginning. He needed to find the weapon Mark valued most and turn it against him. The subtle sabotage wasn't enough for Mark. The bully needed a crowd. He needed to prove his dominance with a public spectacle. He organized a meeting under the guise of an all-hands project post-mortem and strategy alignment session. It was held in the large boardroom, a chamber of polished chrome and frosted glass designed for maximum visibility. Jack walked into the room. He felt the atmosphere, heavy and cold, saturated with unspoken tension. The room was full. Every key contributor, every manager, and several floating executives were present. They were not there for strategy. They were there for the show. Mark stood at the head of the immense oak table, bathed in the sharp white glow of the projector light. He looked less like a manager and more like a prosecutor. He wore a crisp, tailored suit, a visual contrast to Jack's slightly worn, comfortable blazer. Mark started the presentation. The title slide flashed. Project Chimera, Systemic Failures and Accountability. He began by reading with theatrical gravitas the exact wording of the email he'd sent, detailing Jack's supposed inability to leverage necessary resources. Mark used bloated metrics and colorful charts to illustrate the projected financial damage caused by the delay figures Jack knew were wildly inflated. "We cannot," Mark declared, his voice ringing with false concern, "allow one individual's disregard for proactive alignment to compromise the integrity of our entire divisional timeline." The language was weaponized. He never named Jack directly, but the slides showed Jack's project name, and Mark's eyes, cold and sharp, continuously darted to Jack. The room was silent. A fearful, stifling silence. The younger employees stared at their laptops, pretending to take furious notes. The veterans, the Bobs of the office, avoided Jack's gaze, their faces etched with a familiar resignation. They were the neighbors who wouldn't look Karen in the eye. They knew the truth, but they were paralyzed by the fear of being the next target. Jack sat at the table, his spine rigid. He felt the communal shame and anger of the room. This wasn't just an attack on him. It was an attack on every person there who valued honest work over corporate posturing. Mark pressed his advantage, waving a printout, the official deadline "Miss Notice" like a flag of victory. "This," Mark insisted, his voice rising, "is what happens when we ignore the modern framework and cling to outdated individualistic methods." Jack felt the heat rush into his neck. The old familiar. Rage was building again, a deep, molten core of fury. Mark was calling his entire career, his lifetime of honest building, outdated. But Jack held firm. He knew Mark was fishing for a reaction, a shout, an argument, a public loss of temper that would cement Jack's image as the volatile old veteran. Jack met Mark's gaze. His expression was a dangerous blend of contempt and absolute calm. He did not speak. He did not flinch. He simply let Mark dig his own grave deeper, one absurd corporate syllable at a time. When the meeting ended, Mark basked in the moment, accepting hushed compliments on his thoroughness. As Jack gathered his pen and notepad, Mark approached the table, leaning in close. Mark's voice dropped to a triumphant hiss. "Enjoy your desk while you can, Jack. Your methods are no longer sustainable." Jack didn't acknowledge the insult. He simply looked at Mark's slick, expensive suit and replied, his voice barely a whisper. "The foundation is always the most important part, Mark, but you never learned how to check yours." Jack walked out of the room. The scent of ozone and tension lingered. Mark stood frozen by Jack's quiet defiance, the smug smile momentarily cracked. The war was personal, now fought not just for a job, but for the soul of the work itself. Mark's public humiliation of Jack was merely the dress rehearsal. The true act came 2 days later, delivered with the cold efficiency of a guillotine. It arrived in the form of a formal HR notification. Not an email, but a printed memo, thick, heavy stock, delivered by a solemn young intern who looked like he regretted his life choices. The subject line, stark and chilling: "Final notice. Recommendation for termination of employment." The report was Mark's magnum opus, a synthesis of every petty email, every fabricated metric, and every exaggerated delay from the past 3 months. Mark had spent countless hours compiling the document, using his expensive jargon and flowcharts to build a compelling narrative of Jack's terminal non-compliance and disregard for integrated resource stewardship. It was a brilliant lie packaged to look like unassailable truth. It cited the financial losses from Project Chimera, directly attributing them to Jack's outdated individualistic methods. Mark hadn't just recommended firing Jack. He had framed it as an act of corporate salvation. Jack picked up the memo. The heavy paper felt like a stone slab in his hands. He read Mark's signature scrolled at the bottom with an aggressive flourish, a signature of absolute unearned triumph. The final insult arrived moments later, a personal encrypted chat message from Mark. Short. Venomous. Enjoy your projects while you can, Jack. Clock's ticking. This is what proactive alignment looks like. Jack did not break the paper. He did not curse. He walked to the window, the harsh fluorescent light reflecting off the glass. Down below, the city, traffic flowed in a river of noise. Jack felt the molten core of rage solidify into something colder, harder, and infinitely more dangerous. Resolve. Mark wanted him to lose his peace. Mark wanted him to panic and beg. Jack looked down at his scarred hands. 35 years. He would not let a spoiled, insecure boy steal his dignity. He folded the termination recommendation neatly. He slipped it into his briefcase right next to the Employee Handbook. He had begun studying weeks ago. Mark had built his house of cards on a mountain of minutiae. Jack was about to use the foundation. Mark ignored the real rules to blow it all down. The time for defense was over. The time for the investigation, the quiet, meticulous, career-ending counterstrike had begun. Jack did not rush to HR. He went home. He sat at his kitchen table, a surface scarred by projects and family meals, and spread out the Employee Handbook. It was a massive binder-sized volume ignored by everyone except the HR department, and now Jack. Mark believed power was found in superficial jargon. Jack knew power was found in the fine print. Jack began reading. He read the sections on IT policy, resource allocation, and travel expenses. He was looking for the equivalent of Mark's unregistered boat, the single fatal violation Mark was too arrogant to believe applied to him. The words blurred for hours, the legal prose thick and dry. He ordered a pizza. The only sound in the house was the rustling of paper and the occasional slurp of lukewarm coffee. Then he found it. Not one section, but a cluster of rules regarding conflict of interest and outside activity restrictions. The policies were absolute: all outside consulting, all use of company assets for personal gain, and all secondary income streams that conflicted with the company's business model must be disclosed and approved by the CEO. Jack's lips curved into the cold smile Evelyn had witnessed earlier. Mark had been using the office, the corporate title, and the company's time to run a side consulting business, a fact Mark occasionally bragged about in hushed tones, believing himself untouchable. Jack felt a jolt of pure, cold electricity. The bully had built his throne on a fundamental violation. The core of his competence was a lie. Jack now held the first heavy stone he needed to drop on Mark's head. Mark believed his arrogance was protection. He thought his youth and corporate connections made him immune to the simple mechanics of accounting. He was wrong. Jack the Builder understood that every structure leaves a paper trail, or in Mark's case, a digital trail. After identifying the key violation, conflict of interest, Jack moved from the legal code to the financial records. He did not have access to Mark's private accounts, but he had access to Mark's expense reports and company travel logs. The same reports Mark proudly submitted, detailing his extravagant lifestyle. Mark always flaunted his success. Jack had to look past the large, flashy expenditures and focus on the microscopic details. He spent the next day immersed in spreadsheets, the blue light of the monitor reflecting coldly in his eyes. He analyzed Mark's recent business development trips. Mark always claimed these trips were to meet prospective high-value clients for the company. Jack cross-referenced these dates with publicly available data conference schedules, local business directories, and the registration filings for Mark's side consulting firm, Synergy Solutions LLC. The first connection hit Jack like a physical blow. Mark had billed the company $800 for a trip to Atlanta in February. Mark claimed he was meeting an official company vendor. Jack found a registration document showing that Mark's Synergy Solutions LLC was sponsoring a small regional consulting workshop in Atlanta on those exact dates. Mark wasn't prospecting for the company. He was using the company's travel budget to fund his personal enterprise. Jack meticulously documented every discrepancy. Another trip to Chicago, allegedly for cross-departmental alignment, coincided precisely with a 2-day executive coaching seminar hosted by Synergy Solutions LLC. Mark had even billed the company for the rental car he used to ferry his side clients to the seminar. The scent of blood was in the water now. Jack knew Mark used expensive proprietary software for his personal consulting tools the company did not authorize for external use. Mark, in his zeal to look competent, had often bragged about his software licenses. Jack accessed the company's internal IT asset register. Mark was listed as the sole user of a $5,000 graphics rendering program. Jack remembered Mark mentioning the program was key to creating immersive visualization packages for his Synergy Solutions clients. Jack filed an anonymous internal IT request, citing an unusual licensing usage pattern. The IT report came back swiftly. The program's license key was being activated simultaneously from Mark's work laptop and an external residential IP address at 2:00 a.m. This was Mark's unauthorized dock extension, using company property, company time, and company money to build his own kingdom. It was a clear, unassailable violation of 3 separate IT and ethics policies. The evidence was mounting piece by piece, building a formidable counterstructure. Jack printed the evidence, the conflicting travel dates, the cross-referenced expense reports, the damning IT usage logs. He was building his own binder, a weapon forged not from corporate jargon, but from hard, undeniable facts. He looked at the pile of paper. It smelled faintly of toner and justice. Mark thought he was firing Jack. Jack realized he was gathering the ammunition to dismantle Mark's entire life. The quiet satisfaction was immense. Mark was standing on rotting planks, and Jack had just found the crowbar. Jack knew that even the thickest binder of evidence needed a witness, a soul who had suffered under the same tyrant and could vouch for the pattern of abuse. He needed Bob, real name. Stanley was an IT veteran, a silent guardian of the company's network. Stanley was gruff, exhausted, and generally avoided corporate politics. He had been quietly marginalized by Mark 2 years prior after refusing to install unauthorized software on his machine. Stanley was the neighbor who muttered under his breath, but never stood up in the HOA meeting. Jack arranged to meet Stanley not in the open plan office, but at a Greasy Spoon diner 4 miles away. A place where the coffee was strong and the booth vinyl was cracked. A place Mark would never set foot. The diner was loud with the clatter of plates and the hiss of the fryer. The anonymity was protective. Stanley arrived, his eyes already etched with suspicion. He slid into the booth, his hands clutching a chipped coffee mug. "You should know," Stanley said, his voice a low growl. "I don't have time for this corporate drama, Jack. Mark's a bully, we know it. But he's untouchable." Jack nodded slowly, calmly. He didn't try to convince him. He simply laid out the evidence, the printout showing Mark's double billing on the Atlanta trip, and the IT report showing the concurrent software usage. "This isn't drama, Stanley," Jack said, tapping the papers. "This is theft. He's using company resources and time for Synergy Solutions. He violated the conflict of interest clause." Stanley looked at the papers. The suspicion in his eyes slowly shifted to cold recognition. He stared at the IT report. "The IP address," Stanley whispered, tapping the code. He used the remote desktop VPN. He thought we wouldn't look outside the firewall. He thought he was too smart. Stanley pushed his chipped mug away. That wasn't the worst of it, Jack. He tried to cover his tracks. Stanley leaned in the smell of burnt bacon and stale coffee surrounding them. He revealed that 3 weeks ago, Mark had cornered him in the server room, demanding Stanley permanently delete certain archived expense reports and historical emails. Mark had framed it as routine data cleansing. Stanley, the old IT sentinel, had refused. He had quietly filed a ticket about the unusual request, tagging it security concern. But Mark's authority had buried the ticket immediately. However, Stanley had done one more thing. "I didn't delete the emails," Stanley confirmed, his eyes now blazing with a quiet fire. "I backed them up on a secondary, isolated drive, just in case the Queen came looking for a witch hunt." Stanley had provided Jack with the digital, smoking gun Mark's internal email, where he demanded the destruction of the evidence. It was the digital equivalent of Mark desperately trying to sink his own boat to avoid the impound. Jack felt a triumphant jolt run through his system. Stanley hadn't just confirmed the violation, he had provided evidence of obstruction of justice within the company. "I want him gone, Jack," Stanley said, his voice shaking slightly. "He took my promotion. He called me outdated. Now you use that." Jack didn't need to ask Stanley to testify. The document spoke for itself. Jack thanked him, his gaze steady. He left Stanley sitting in the diner, the quiet IT man now armed with the profound relief of finally fighting back. Jack walked out into the harsh afternoon sun, the heavy files in his briefcase. He had the weapon. He had the witness. He was ready to pull the trigger. Jack knew Mark controlled the gatekeepers. Sending the binder to Evelyn in HR would only result in delays, bureaucracy, and Mark mounting a frantic, desperate defense. Jack refused to play on Mark's field. He executed a strategic flanking maneuver. Jack reached out not to HR, but to Mr. Wallace, the Chief Operating Officer, COO. Shucks. Wallace was a veteran of the industry, an old-school executive. Jack had built 2 successful refineries for a decade prior. Wallace was the company's true governing authority, the one Mark's nepotistic connections couldn't touch. Jack requested a private off-site meeting. The note was simple, direct, and focused not on Mark, but on profit and stability. "I have identified a significant structural weakness in Division 7's management framework, causing material loss to Q4 projections. I have a solution for immediate course correction." The meeting was set for a dark, oak-paneled room downtown. Jack did not lead with the accusations. He first presented his solution, a detailed, pragmatic plan for reorganizing the division, eliminating bureaucratic choke points, and recovering the Chimera project timeline. It was a strategy born of competence, not anger. Only after presenting the profitable reorganization plan did Jack slide the binder across the table. "Mr. Wallace," Jack said calmly, "the current managerial failure is not accidental. The man who caused the structural loss, Mark, is actively using company assets and time to run a private consulting firm, a clear violation of Ethics Policy 3.2. He has also filed a fraudulent termination request against me to cover his tracks." Wallace didn't flinch. He opened the binder. He didn't see petty office drama. He saw fraud and negligence impacting the bottom line. He saw Mark's expensive suit concealing a liability. Jack had not asked for justice. He had asked for leadership. He was ready to assume the role Mark had stolen. The morning of the decisive meeting arrived thick and gray like iron dust. The time was 9:30 a.m. Mark, oblivious to the structural failures beneath his feet, swaggered into the executive conference room, the same room where Jack had had his brief, cryptic talk with Evelyn. Mark wore his most expensive, crisply tailored suit, a visual declaration of victory. His hair was slicked back, his Mont Blanc pen nestled in his breast pocket like a medal. He had summoned the key players, Evelyn from HR, 3 mid-level managers, who were his loyalists, and several silent peripheral staff members, the audience he required for his spectacle. Mark stood at the head of the mahogany table, radiating smug confidence. He tapped his shiny shoe impatiently. He looked exactly like a prosecutor who knew the jury was already swayed. Jack entered the room last. He moved slowly, deliberately. He wore a simple, functional blazer, the antithesis of Mark's ostentation. Under his arm, he carried his worn leather briefcase, its contents the binder of truth, silent and heavy. Jack took a seat near the end of the table, away from the spotlight. He didn't look at Mark. He looked at the window where the weak morning sun was trying to penetrate the city haze. He was composed, motionless. Mark began the meeting without preamble, his voice loud, cutting through the silence. "Thank you all for attending this necessary, if unpleasant, session." Mark opened his own folder, its papers rustling dramatically. "We are here to finalize the action regarding Jack. As my exhaustive report detailed, his terminal non-compliance and failure to integrate into the modern framework have caused material documented loss." Mark spent the next 15 minutes performing his final triumphant act. He presented his inflated metrics, his colorful charts, and quoted his own emails, a relentless self-citation designed to drown the room in jargon and manufactured authority. He did not argue. He pronounced. He framed Jack's firing not as a personnel issue but as a mandatory, corporate cleansing. "The evidence is irrefutable," Mark concluded, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. He slammed his hand lightly on the table, the small sound echoing in the tension. "We must make an example. Failure to act is failure to lead. I recommend the immediate effective termination of Jack's employment." Mark stood back, allowing his loyalists to nod eagerly. He looked directly at Jack, his face a mask of triumphant malice. Mark believed he had delivered the final fatal blow. But the executioner had just handed the condemned man the key to the armory. Jack didn't even flinch. He simply reached down and slowly, methodically opened his briefcase. The real show was about to begin. Mark stood back from the table, flushed with adrenaline and self-congratulation. The room was silent, waiting for Evelyn to read the termination order. Before Evelyn could speak, Jack moved, slow, deliberate. He reached into his worn briefcase and pulled out the binder of truth. It landed on the mahogany table with a quiet, solid thud, the sound cutting through the tension like a gunshot. Mark stared at the binder, his triumphant expression freezing in place. Jack rose, his movement unhurried. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't engage with Mark's emotional theater. He focused on the facts. "With all due respect, Mark," Jack said, his voice deep and steady, "you've spent 15 minutes talking about my perceived failures in aesthetic uniformity. Now let's discuss yours in ethical compliance." Jack flipped the cover of the binder, revealing the first tab, Conflict of Interest. "You claimed my methods caused material loss." Jack continued, his eyes locking onto Mark's pale face. "But the real loss came from you using company resources, time, travel, budget, and hardware to run your private consulting firm, Synergy Solutions LLC." Jack slid the printed evidence across the table, the double-billed Atlanta travel expenses, cross-referenced with the public registration for Mark's personal seminar. The receipt smelled faintly of ozone from the printer. A visible ripple went through the room. The mid-level managers, previously Mark's loyalists, shifted uncomfortably. Evelyn's eyes went wide as she scanned the documents. Mark exploded. His composure, carefully constructed over years of shallow ambition, shattered. "This is irrelevant!" Mark shouted, his voice cracking. The sound was high, thin, and desperate. This is a distraction from your documented incompetence. Is it? Jack asked, his voice remaining level. He flipped to the second tab, Asset Misappropriation. The company paid $5,000 for specialized rendering software. You claimed it was for Division 7, but the IT log confirms that same license key was being used concurrently from your home IP address at 2 in the morning. Not for us, but for Synergy Solutions. Jack paused, letting the implications sink in. That is theft of service, Mark. That is a clear violation of 3 different IT and ethics policies that you never read. Mark was stammering now, his face flushing a painful deep crimson. He looked like a cornered animal. He knew the IT logs were unassailable. And finally, Jack stated, flipping to the last tab, Obstruction. He presented the email from Stanley detailing Mark's demand to delete the archived expense reports. You tried to fire me to cover your tracks, Jack concluded, placing his hands firmly on the binder. You built your throne on the shakiest of foundations, fraud and arrogance. You demanded we adhere to the rules, but you saw yourself as untouchable. Mark reached across the table, his hand trembling, attempting to snatch the documents back. This is a lie. I will sue the company. Evelyn, the HR head, slammed her own hand down on the termination folder. The battle was no longer between Mark and Jack. It was between Mark and the overwhelming weight of the truth. Mark was still shrieking about his legal rights and defamation. Evelyn, the HR head, looked terrified, clutching the termination file like a useless shield. The room had dissolved into a chaotic murmur. Then the door to the conference room opened sharply. Mr. Wallace, the Chief Operating Officer, CUO, entered. He was a tall, imposing man carrying the true gravity of executive power. Behind him walked Mr. Davis, the company CEO, the ultimate authority. The room went instantly dead silent. The sudden presence of the company's highest authorities was a physical shock. Mark saw them and, momentarily forgetting his panic, saw opportunity. He rushed toward the CEO, his voice regaining a desperate pitch. Mr. Davis, shh, you must see this. Jack is sabotaging me. He is using false documents. Mr. Davis did not acknowledge Mark. His eyes, cold and assessing, swept the room, resting briefly on Jack's calm face. Mr. Wallace stepped forward, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that demanded attention. Thank you all for this demonstration. Mark, we have reviewed your reports, and more importantly, we have reviewed the supplementary evidence provided by Mr. Jack. Wallace held up a copy of the Itsuyu binder of truth. Mark's face went white. He knew that binder contained the proof of his destruction. Stakitsiko, the board. Wallace continued, his tone cutting like ice. Has acknowledged Mark's report detailing the terminal systemic breakdown in Division 7. However, we disagree on the cause. He looked directly at Mark, his eyes filled with contempt. The cause is not a failure of methodology. The cause is a failure of ethics, leadership, and integrity. Wallace slammed the binder down. Mark, you are immediately relieved of all supervisory duties, pending an internal investigation into multiple documented violations of the Ethics Code, including conflict of interest and misappropriation of company assets. You are terminated effective immediately. Mark stood frozen, his jaw slack. The sudden loss of everything power, status, reputation was a physical blow. Wallace turned, his expression softening slightly as he looked at Jack. Jack, the strategy you presented to us last week, the plan for the restructure and the Chimera project recovery, is sound. The board has approved it. Wallace extended his hand to Jack, the movement slow and monumental. Congratulations, Jack. You have been promoted to senior manager of this newly restructured division. You are to assume command immediately, starting with the full management of Project Chimera and the oversight of all necessary personnel transitions. The quiet of the room broke into an explosive, chaotic cheer. Not from Mark's loyalists who sat in stunned silence, but from the silent peripheral staff, the Bobs and the Stanleys, who had watched the abuse for too long. They clapped loudly, their fear suddenly replaced by profound relief. Jack, the veteran, stood tall. He gripped Wallace's hand, his rough, scarred palm meeting the COO's smooth skin. He had not asked for justice. He had earned the power to enact it. Mark let out a choked sound, half sob, half roar, and lunged toward the table, desperate to grab his pen. Mr. Davis simply motioned to two security guards who had appeared silently at the door. Mark was escorted out, his Mont Blanc pen and his shredded dignity left behind on the table. He was a noisy, pathetic footnote to Jack's quiet, decisive victory. The air in the conference room slowly began to clear, the bitter smell of fear replaced by the cleaner scent of possibility. Jack's hands, which had built his career, now clasped the power to rebuild the division. He looked at the colleagues who had just clapped, recognizing the community he had fought to save. Mark's resistance was predictably frantic. He attempted to fight the termination-threatening lawsuits and appeals. But the evidence, Jack's meticulous binder corroborated by Stanley's IT logs and the COO's executive order, was absolute. Mark's side consulting firm, his Synergy Solutions, collapsed without company resources, a final fitting irony. Mark was gone, a noisy, embarrassing memory. Jack did not spend his new power seeking revenge. He enacted his plan immediately. He dismantled the unnecessary bureaucracy, empowering the technical experts and eliminating the corporate jargon that had choked creativity. The division thrived. The Chimera project, once stagnant, hit its timeline with weeks to spare. The atmosphere in the office changed. The fluorescent lights seemed less harsh. The constant gnawing fear dissipated. Colleagues started laughing openly again. They waved to Jack, not with the performative reverence they showed Mark, but with genuine earned respect. Jack had not just won a job, he had restored the dignity of the work. He often sat at his new large desk, a desk Mark had coveted, looking out the window. He kept the worn leather briefcase nearby. The bully never wins in the end, Jack would sometimes think. They thrive on fear, but fear only works until someone refuses to break. Mark tried to destroy Jack's career with fraud and arrogance, but Jack used patience, experience, and the truth of the rules to turn a termination notice into a moment of absolute triumph. He didn't just get his dock back, he bought the whole harbor. This victory is not just Jack's. It belongs to every person who has been quietly targeted by a corporate bully who confuses title with talent. It's a testament to the fact that competence, integrity, and the simple knowledge of the rules are always more powerful than superficial arrogance. Now we want to hear from you. Have you ever had a Mark or a Karen at your job? How did you fight back? Did you use the corporate handbook? Share your stories of workplace redemption in the comments below. If Jack's story resonated with you, show your support. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story of the takedown, because the best revenge is always earned promotion.